Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Claire Robertson from the Weinberg Group, and I will be moderating this presentation titled, It's All in the Details, Tips for Ensuring a Successful NDA Filing. The Weinberg Group is the leading food and drug consultancy with headquarters in Washington, D.C., as well as an office in San Francisco. The speaker on today's webinar is Dr. Bob Roth, Vice President and Worldwide Medical Director at the Weinberg Group. Dr. Roth holds 2 doctorates, a Ph.D. in biochemistry from Baylor and an M.D. from the University of Texas at Galveston. Bob provides consultation at all stages of the research, development, and marketing of FDA-regulated drugs, devices, and biologics. A noted author and speaker, Dr. Roth has led numerous projects in pharmacovigilance. During the course of today's presentation, you will be able to submit questions to be answered by Dr. Roth at the end of the presentation. We will try to answer as many questions as possible today. However, if we are unable to get to all of them, we will email the answers along with the slides within a week. With that, we will begin the webinar.
Thank you very much, Claire, and a special thanks to all participants listening in today. The focus of the webinar today is to discuss some issues related to compiling and submitting a new drug application. The focus today is going to be outside of the more technical safety, efficacy, and chemistry manufacturing sections, and more specifically to highlight administrative elements that are very often overlooked or left until the last minute. Hopefully after listening today, you'll have learned some tips on coordinating a timely and successful filing. Now, to begin with, I'd like to take a step back and take a look at the overall structure of a new drug application file. Module 1, which we'll speak about extensively today, is comprised of all the administrative information in the NDA. This section is region-specific, that is the U.S. versus the rest of the world, and the contents differ depending on where you're submitting, which regulatory agency you're submitting the application to. Module 2 is the location of all the technical information, the summaries and overviews of drug quality, the non-clinical data, and the clinical data. There are technical sections discussing the drug substance, the drug product, all the non-clinical pharmacology and toxicology information, and then the actual clinical results. And all of this material is contained within modules 2, 3, 4, and 5, and together considered the common technical document. Now, before you begin the process of compiling the NDA, it's important to first review any information that you have from meetings with previous meetings with the agency, as well as any written correspondences. What you're trying to do is make sure that you recall any clues that FDA may have given you about what FDA expects to see in the NDA, how the data should be presented, and special topics that need to be covered. It's easy to forget some of these hints unless you review the written and correspondence in the minutes. FDA certainly does, and it's really important that sponsors as well pay attention to these sources of information. Very often, when you look back at especially meeting minutes, you will find sentences to begin with, in your NDA you should provide, and then details are given. You may not have agreed to provide this information, and at times sponsors decide not to provide such information, but it's a reminder of what the FDA is expecting to see. And if you don't expect to fulfill all these obligations, there should be a plan for why not. Another important step that should be taken during the planning phase for the NDA is whether you're going to request and have a pre-NDA meeting. These are typically face-to-face meetings in Bethesda. They're optional. The meetings are optional, but very highly recommended. It's very rare that you can guess exactly everything that FDA is going to want to see in your application without having a discussion specifically about the application. What you risk without having a pre-NDA meeting is a refuse to file or an application that doesn't deal with a significant review issue that may only be brought up at the pre-NDA meeting. Basically, the primary objective of the meeting is to confirm the sufficiency of your data package and make sure that you intend to provide all the data and the special presentations of the data that FDA is expecting. Now, one reason for confirming the plans for the NDA is that over the years, things can happen to expectations for your final submission. Opinions of reviewers can evolve over time. We have certainly seen that reviewers over time gain proprietary information they cannot share with sponsors, but information from reviews of similar products to yours, and all of a sudden requirements are put on you that apparently come out of left field but are really related to decisions that FDA has made for other sponsors. This sort of information may not be available or communicated to you before the pre-NDA meeting. Also, should be mentioned that personnel change over time. Many years can go by between the time of a pre-IND meeting and the pre-NDA meeting and the submission of the final document. And new members may have different viewpoints than old members, so it's always good to confirm understandings that you have previously. The topics that traditionally are discussed are the content of your submission, the studies that will be included, discussion around how integrated sections, the ISS and the ISE, are put together and presented. And there's generally some sort of questions related to the case report forms and the data set formats and any special requests that the agency may happen. Now, the first thing that we want to spend some time talking about today is the administrative information that's found in Module 1. This is the area of the application that's region-specific and not technically part of the common technical document. A number of elements that we'll discuss in a little bit of detail each are the cover letter, administrative information, references and authorizations to information, waivers, environmental assessment, labeling, and a brief discussion about the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, or REMS, processes. The cover letter is seemingly simple, but it needs to be carefully crafted so that all the information is exquisitely accurate. The date of the letter should be the actual date of the filing. That's important so that the action date is determined appropriately. and that there's no confusion about when the filing actually occurs. One portion of the application that you have a opportunity for but not an obligation is to submit a reviewer's guide along with the cover letter. In our experience, this can be a very helpful tool to FDA and in their review, because it's not always evident where in a very, very long NDA you may have some particular information that you know FDA is particularly interested in. And by putting together a general table of contents of what's in the NDA, where things can be found, and in particular any issues that you know are important to FDA, this can avoid a lot of confusion during the review period. If there are some special requests that FDA has made for particular information or particular discussions, it's very useful to let the reviewers know with the reviewer's guide exactly where you have addressed these issues. There are a variety of required forms. I'm not going to go into them in any detail, but there is the application to market the new drug form, the user fee cover sheet form, which needs to be filled out regardless of whether you receive a fee waiver or not. Along with the form, you should provide either proof of payment or a copy of a waiver notification if such exists. Significant planning may need to happen for submitting of user fees. The current user fee for an application requiring clinical data is over nearly $2 million, and next year will be over $2 million. You can get the user fee waived or reduced if you meet certain criteria. Most commonly, waivers are granted for small businesses submitting their first human drug application, and waivers and reductions can also be granted if it's necessary to protect human health or if a fee would present a significant financial barrier to the sponsor. So it's not black and white, and a variety of different final user fee amounts may be decided upon. If you think you're eligible for a waiver, it's important to submit this request in writing as early as possible. It can take several months to hear back from FDA, and if you haven't received a waiver at the time of your submission, you'll have to pay the user fee at that point and then request a refund. This can take quite a long time before the refund happens, and we've seen that happen before. So it makes it's very important that if you think that you're eligible for a waiver, that you submit the request as early as possible. There are a number of certifications that fall under the general heading of administrative information. While none of these are particularly difficult to provide, they can sort of pile up, and they're typically done at the last minute. So it makes sense to recognize what all of the parts are and attempt to deal with at least some of them as early as possible. The first is the Debarment Certification, a statement that no person associated with the application has been debarred. The financial certifications are related to any financial relationships that may exist with investigators, and you do need to tell FDA if any of the investigators are receiving compensation that's affected by the outcome of the studies, if any investigator has any equity interest in the sponsor company, or if there's been any other type of payment made to the investigator. And if there aren't any relationships to disclose, a single form can be submitted which covers all investigators. You're also required to submit patent information and associated certifications at the time of the FDA filing. Also necessary is a field copy certification, depending on whether the NDA is being filed electronically or as a paper submission. If you're submitting in paper, you must submit a separately bound copy of the quality section, the CMC Module 3 section of the NDA, to the appropriate field office, and submit a letter to the NDA stating that the copy has been provided. If your filing is electronic, as is the case most of the time these days, you need to send a letter to the field office notifying them that the NDA has been filed electronically, and include a copy of that particular letter with your drug application. Also included in Module 1 are any letters of authorization. These can include letters to allow the FDA to review drug master files if you're referencing them in your application. If that's the case, you'll need to submit a separate letter for each DMF. These will typically contain CMC, chemistry manufacturing information on some component of the drug product, and the letter obtained from the DMF holder will allow the FDA to review the technical information and that you have referenced in your NDA. We should make a note here that it's advisable, if possible, for sponsors to actually review a particular drug master file before it is simply referenced and authorized. The fact that a drug master file exists does not guarantee that the quality of the information will be seen by FDA as being sufficient. There's also a right of reference that needs to be submitted in an application in which you plan to reference data owned by some other entity. This again allows FDA permission to access the data and study reports as well as the underlying data themselves. Another important component of Module 1 are the sections which relate to the pediatric research requirements. The Pediatric Research Equity Act of 2003 authorized FDA to require pediatric studies of drugs that are likely to be used in children, and consequently all NDAs need to include a pediatric assessment which can either provide pediatric data or a request of a waiver or deferral of such research requirements. It is advisable to discuss with FDA whether such studies will be needed and in particular when they may be needed, that is pre-approval or post-approval, and have these discussions as early as possible in your development program. Although you can wait until the NDA is submitted to also request a waiver or deferral of pediatric studies, the risk to you, the sponsor, is that you learn the answer late in the process of the review. If you submitted early a waiver or deferral and it's been granted, this information should be documented in your NDA. There is a draft guidance, FDA draft guidance, that explains how best to comply with the Act. FDA regulations specify that environmental assessments must be submitted as part of an NDA unless the drug qualifies for some sort of categorical exclusion. FDA will look at a number of different issues to determine whether your drug does qualify for exclusion, and specifically you may qualify if the approval of the product would not increase the use of the active moiety, or if it does increase the use of the active moiety, the estimated concentration that would enter the aquatic environment is less than 1 part per billion, or if your drug substance naturally occurs in the environment, that the approval of your product would not significantly change its concentration or distribution. If you do qualify for an exclusion, you must submit a statement to that effect in your NDA. And this is important because if you fail to provide either an environmental assessment or a claim of exclusion, that could be sufficient grounds for refusing to file your NDA. Again, there's guidance information for this topic. Labeling is another large and important section of Module 1. This is often one of the last pieces of the NDA document to be completed prior to filing, and it very often requires coordination between many interested parties. Discussions about labeling and decisions about wording can involve input from regulatory affairs department, the clinical and non-clinical staff in the company, marketing folks, and even folks in the chemistry manufacturing area of the company. This slide has a list of the documents that need to be included in the labeling section, including the drug carton and container labels, draft labeling text, annotated labeling, comprehension studies, label comprehension studies if they apply, and also information about the investigational drug labeling. Risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, or REMS, are important for an increasing number of drug applications these days. The area is still relatively new. REMS are an evolving process. The Fda 2007 Act established a framework that allows FDA to require enforceable risk management programs, and many NDAs, BLAs, and even generic ANDA applications may be required to include a risk mitigation strategy. Also, increasingly, REMS may be required post-approval when FDA becomes aware through its own monitoring of adverse events that a particular safety problem needs to be addressed. The elements for risk evaluation and mitigation strategy can be varied. The FDA may determine that a simple medication guide or a patient package insert would suffice to assure the safe use of the drug. In other instances, FDA may determine that a communication plan targeted at healthcare providers is necessary. This can include sending letters to healthcare providers, to pharmacies, distributors, and other entities. Other ways to assure safe use that may be required can include requirements for special provider training, provider certification, limited distribution, and patient registries. All REMS must include a timetable for assessments, typically 18 months, 3 years, 7 years, and perhaps more. And the main message here is that if FDA requires a REMS for your product, this can be quite a time-consuming process to decide what the strategy should be and then put it down on paper. So this needs to be addressed reasonably early in the preparation of the NDA. I'd like to switch the focus of discussion now to Clinical Module 5. This section tends to be complex, large and complex in most NDAs with many, many associated pieces. This slide has a list of typical components of a Module 5, clinical study reports with their appendices, case report forms, data listings, data sets and data definition files, annotated case report forms, and of particular interest, which we'll discuss further in additional slides, the integrated summary of efficacy and the integrated summary of safety. I'd like to make a few comments about the clinical study reports themselves. Study reports are created in a granular format with several separate documents comprising the entire report. The components in general consist of a synopsis, a body of the report, and then a variable number of appendices. It's not uncommon that very old clinical studies conducted early in the development of a program, drug development program, perhaps by an earlier IND holder, would also contribute important information to your NDA. And these types of studies can be provided in the NDA as legacy reports. These are typically smaller reports in a single document as opposed to the granular format study reports. It's important to make sure that protocols are clearly identified and described, including, importantly, any changes that occurred with different versions of the protocol. There is a guidance, 1996 ICH guidance that deals with the preparation of study reports. We get a lot of questions from sponsors about which case report forms need to be provided in an NDA. This makes a lot of sense. Sponsors are concerned about the level of effort and resources that must go into collating and preparing these records. The general rule is that CRFs must be provided for any subjects with a fatal outcome, any subjects with serious adverse events, or subjects who withdrew from the study due to adverse events. In some cases, FDA may want to see additional CRFs based on other, particularly safety issues. So it's helpful to discuss with the agency during the pre-NDA meeting which CRFs you intend to provide and get the agency's buy-in. In the case of an electronic NDA, publication and processing of case report forms can take quite a bit of time, so this activity should be started as soon as the finalized CRFs are made available. Each subject's complete CRF should be provided as a single PDF file, either as a scanned version of the paper CRF or as a report generated from electronic data capture forms. In either case, readability is key, making sure that everything can be clearly read and that no data are cut off. CRFs are bookmarked by study visit and domain, and bookmarks should be as descriptive as possible without abbreviations to ensure that reviewers understand where to locate data. Another important component to case report forms is the audit trail. FDA will want to be able to clearly identify any changes that were made to the case report forms, as well as reasons why changes had been made. It's very helpful to document links between the documentation of the change and the data itself. Another important element of clinical study documentation are data sets. There are usually multiple data sets generated from clinical studies, so it's important to discuss with FDA which data set should be provided, data elements that should be included in each one, and organization of the data within the files. The review division may want to see your data in a particular format, so this is important to confirm with the agency and also with your CRO. FDA has a series of specifications for how data should be organized and presented, so it's important to make sure that your data management group or CRO is aware of current standards for things like data labels, character limits, annotated CRFs, and data definition files. This may seem like minor issues, but in fact problems with data set compliance can result in refuse to file and therefore have major implications. Our experience has taught us that checking clinical data set compliance can take some considerable time, and because the finalization of clinical data are often rate limiting, there's very often a rush at the end of the NDA preparation process to prepare the information for the submission. So it's important to plan ahead as much as possible. The integrated summary of efficacy and the integrated summary of safety are required elements for all submissions. Please note these are different than the summaries of safety and efficacy presented in Module 2, which are generally succinct and high-level summaries. The presentations in the ISS and the ISE are in fact not summaries at all, but are integrated analyses of data across studies and typically can be extremely long and detailed. These are required sections no matter what kind of NDA you are submitting. Because of the amount of effort that's involved in these sections, it's helpful to discuss the plans with FDA in advance. This is usually at the pre-NDA meeting. You can consider submitting statistical analysis plans to FDA to review so that you can ensure that the analyses in the ISS and the ISE will meet their expectations. In the case of the integrated summary of safety, if your active ingredient is already in a marketed product, you may need to provide information from post-market surveillance sources such as the FDA's AIRS database, the DAWN Drug Abuse Warning Network database, or the Poison Control database. Acquiring and analyzing these data can take considerable time and in some cases can be quite costly, so it's helpful to discuss the plan for these presentations with FDA in advance. The ISS and ISE are usually developed near the end of an NDA preparation because they're directly tied into the database lock from your last completed clinical study. Therefore, it's important to have a clear plan and timeline in place for completing these sections. I'd like to make a couple other points that are helpful to keep in mind as you're working through the NDA preparation process. First is related to proprietary names. While the proprietary name does not need to be established prior to filing the NDA, it is a process that takes some time, and getting a head start is generally advisable. Many sponsors like to have a proprietary name tentatively approved early in clinical development so that investigators can begin using the name. This is obviously helpful from a marketing standpoint. Keep in mind that vetting proposed proprietary names can take several months to perform the trademark checks and additional analyses like consumer focus groups and other medication error studies. So again, starting early is helpful. Once you have a proposed trade name, you submit it to FDA, and then the timeline to response can depend on whether you're in the IND or the NDA stage. At the IND stage, the FDA response can take up to 6 months, whereas if you're in the NDA stage, it needs to be accomplished within 90 days or 3 months. You can submit 2 proposed proprietary names rather than 1, identifying one as primary and one as the alternate. In this case, the alternate would not be evaluated unless the primary name is determined to be unacceptable. But the process of submitting 2 names may be helpful and may save time if your primary name turns out not to be acceptable. It's advisable to start this process as early as possible because you may need to go through multiple names with the agency. What you want to avoid, if at all possible, is that the approval of your submission would be delayed because of disputes over your proposed proprietary name. I'd like to make a few brief comments about electronic submissions. The eCTD, electronic CTD, is the preferred format these days for submitting NDAs. It's important that you use uniform templates. This facilitates not only formatting and bookmarking of documents, but also helps the authors make sure that all the necessary content is included. Electronic submissions can involve a large number of files, and there is the opportunity to create hyperlinks between NDA sections. It's useful to set up a system for your authors to indicate where future hyperlinks should be added between and within documents. Finally, it's important to recognize that subsequent submissions and updates to the NDA will also be electronic, and therefore the formats need to be kept consistent. To conclude, we're hopeful that today's webinar has provided some insight into the components of an NDA submission that are often overlooked. Because there are so many different parts of an NDA that are moving in parallel, a great deal of planning, coordination, and patience is required. While a great deal of attention needs to be paid to the summary sections, overviews, and the other technical pieces of the NDA that are in Module 2, the additional administrative elements we discussed today are equally important. These administrative elements can cause significant delays and review issues if they're not addressed. A timely and successful NDA filing depends on addressing all of these issues. I'd like to thank you very much for your time and would be glad to entertain questions.
This concludes the webinar. We have a number of questions. The first is, when is the ideal time to request a pre-NDA meeting?
Well, the ideal timing for the meeting will depend on what issues you have and what your objectives are. The primary objective of a pre-NDA meeting is to confirm the sufficiency of your data package. And so if you want to make sure that you have enough data available to have a meaningful discussion, the more theoretical your information is, the more theoretical FDA's responses will be. And your goal for these meetings should be to get unambiguous answers. The farther along in the process of completing all your studies, the better is the probability that you'll get actionable feedback from FDA.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bob. Our next question is, what constitutes a refusal to file? When will I know if my application has been filed?
The agency can refuse to file an application if it's considered incomplete, if there are deficiencies severe enough to make the application not reviewable or approvable without major modifications. This can be because of clinical issues, CMC, chemistry, manufacturing, control deficiencies. Can be due to problems with electronic files that you submit, or any combination of factors. You'll know within 60 days of submitting your NDA whether it's been accepted for filing, or conversely, if FDA intends to give you a refuse to file. The problem with refuse to file is it can be extremely damaging to your company, to your program. Having a pre-NDA meeting is a very helpful way to mitigate this risk of a refuse to file. You not only get specific feedback from the agency on the data in your application, but they can also, FDA can also provide very useful guidance on the format of the NDA, and all of which can help avoid a refuse to file.
All right. Well, it looks like we're running out of time, and we probably only have time for one more question. So the last question we'll get to is, if you run a Phase 1 program outside the U.S. and come back to the U.S. for Phase 2, would you advise having a pre-IND meeting by default, or only if there are specifics to discuss?
This situation comes up fairly frequently. Our recommendation is that if you're planning to file an IND in the U.S., you should have a pre-IND meeting. This is regardless of whether you're required to do so. You'll need to prepare specific questions that would serve as the topics of discussion at the meeting. In this case, if you've already completed the Phase 1 program, you may simply be laying out your development plan and asking for impact and whether FDA agrees with the overall plan. Obviously, it costs time and money to get ready for and have a pre-IND meeting, but in our experience, it's always advisable to meet with FDA at this juncture to ensure that you're on the right path.
All right. Well, looks like we're definitely out of time now, and thank you, Bob, for the presentation. We will answer the remaining questions within the next week and email them to you along with the slides. In addition, we would appreciate it if you could please take a minute to fill out the brief evaluation survey on the left side of your screen. Thank you for joining our webinar.